WHI.2.2, we're going to continue our discussion of ancient Chinese philosophies. Last video, I introduced you to Taoism after the Seven Warring States. I'm going to introduce you to the two that are arguably more influential of legalism and Confucianism. So we've got two at the essential question at the top: how did Confucianism and legalism shape the development of ancient China? So legalism, I already mentioned, was the philosophies, that way of thinking, whereby people the founder of legalism, Li Si, argued that in order to be successful in society, in order to have order after this period of the Seven Warring States, or during this period of the Seven Warring States, there must be strict authoritarian rule. Authoritarian was when there's strict obedience to an authority. So authoritarian, in many ways, you can think of as very strict and orderly and oftentimes cruel leadership. And Li Si saw this as the way to reunite the Seven Warring States effectively. The leader who adopted this philosophy, I've already introduced you to him, and the leader who ultimately won this period of the Seven Warring States was Qin Shi Huangdi. And he implemented legalism in order to actually unify China and create what we now know as China, Qin China. And that his name itself actually literally means first emperor. So you can see the unification of the territory, and that you can see those dotted lines of the current boundaries of China. So still lots of room to grow, but Qin marks the beginning of China and marks the beginning of implementing legalism. One of the first things that Qin Shi Huangdi was, he created that bureaucracy, that same form of bureaucracy we saw with the Inca Empire. So he's reorganized his government. He creates what's known as the Code of Qin, which are the unified laws and taxes throughout China. So he centralizes leadership in that way, that all of the laws and the taxes are all united under his authority. He also ended the system that's known as feudalism, and it's a system whereby those who own land are the ones who are in charge. We're going to come back to this both in Japan and when we get to the Middle Ages. But essentially, he's changing the systems of authority in the society to ensure the social systems in society to ensure that his political authority supersedes all, comes above all. He also created some positive things. Ways he changed the empire was that he also mandated the creation of irrigation canals to expand farmland, so people would actually be able to live in more places, and the land would be able to more effectively provide for the people. He also unified Chinese culture. So this is all this again, the same concept of legalism, that everything must come back to a single source of authority. So he created a unified language. So those different kingdoms had different languages. Then we saw the Shang Dynasty earlier. The earlier dynasty created that system of glyphs. He's now unifying that across all of China. Much like the Inca, created a 4,000-mile road system across the region, so his authority is now able to be deployed in all places. He also created a unified system of weights, measurements, and coins. So we see some economic unification through the idea that if everyone weighs things the same, if everyone, and really even cultural changes here, that if there's a unified system of how we measure things, a unified system of how we trade in this way, then that would also create more centralized rule. Yet, as a legalist ruler, the Code of Qin was extremely, extremely strict, that system of laws. And Qin Shi Huangdi was an extraordinarily autocratic leader. That's that same term for authoritarian. Extremely strict. It demanded full and complete obedience from all those around him. He burned all books because he didn't want any sort of dissent. Dissent meaning disagreement. Not all books, but a vast majority of the books, to avoid dissent, any sort of challenge to his own power. And he certainly didn't want anything, the implementation of Confucianism, which we'll talk about in just a second, since that would detract from his own power. Another key example of his authoritarian rule is the construction of the Great Wall of China. So Qin Shi Huangdi unified the previous walls that existed where the Great Wall of China now is, and he unified those laws in order to prevent Mongol invasions. Mongols, of course, he now knows geography, that Mongolia would have been just to the north. He created that wall to prevent those invasions. But the people who actually built the Great Wall, is also known as the largest graveyard in the world, sort of colloquially or in regular discussion, because the wall itself was physically built by slave labor and physical or prisoner labor. So debtors, people who dissented against Qin Shi Huangdi, anyone he saw as a challenge, was kidnapped essentially and brought to the Great Wall of China to construct it. So a pretty fantastic architectural achievement for mankind, but also one whose importance we must remember as a key example. It's sort of a physical reminder of that strict rule. McKinley Tech took a trip to China a couple of years ago with Model United Nations. So these are a couple pictures that I took on the Great Wall of China. On the non-reconstructed part, this here is very reconstructed and well built. You can see here that this is sort of more modern. This is the wall. It was built hundreds of years ago, so This is going to be years of decay. And you can see this is where we went through the Jin Shengling part of the Great Wall. There we are, McKinley Tech. That's one of our current students. And you can see we were just hiking up here. It was pretty amazing how treacherous this was. So it really made me think when I was there about how the people who were constructing this were in extremely dangerous conditions. I mean, they were in a place where the way they constructed this was very much, they were in physical danger just to construct this. It wasn't in any way, shape, or form a straight wall. So you can see it's very high. Those were actually the guard towers right there, and the archers would sit in the guard towers to watch for incoming invaders and people trying to leave, both sides. So both kept invaders out. This Great Wall kept invaders out, but it also kept the Chinese in and prevented them from leaving the empire. And they're all the students from McKinley Tech that we went with a couple years ago. So very cool trip. Truly one of the coolest things I've ever done in my whole life. So adding that into another one of the list of things to do before we die. And there you go. That's what, as I mentioned, this was not a wall. I mean, we were climbing on our hands and knees to try to get up many of these different places. It was arguably not particularly safe. So just something cool to see. Here we go with the terracotta warriors. One of the things that really manifested itself, the ways that really showed the power of Qin Shi Huangdi, was this terracotta army that he built, which are these terracotta, just type of clay. His grave, these were found in the 1970s. Just someone accidentally uncovered one of them, and then they started to excavate and found the thousands more. Qin Shi Huangdi was absolutely paranoid, which makes total sense, because if you're a terribly strict ruler, then you're going to build a lot of enemies. One of the ways that he was so paranoid, because people had tried to assassinate him, what he did is he built this absolutely astronomically complicated tomb full of all kinds of different traps and different compartments, and that tomb was filled with these. They're called terracotta army, and they were designed. These troops were supposedly supposed to protect Qin Shi Huangdi in the afterlife. He actually had artists come and make these soldiers based upon his actual army. So pretty fantastic artisanal work here, but pretty remarkable, and an absolute true sign of the paranoia and one of the consequences that comes from being such a strict ruler. So legalism, that was legalism, and legalism reappears in several capacities throughout Chinese history, but the one that philosophy that most influenced ancient China was Confucianism. So Confucianism also was a philosophy that was created by Confucius, the founder. His actual name was Kong-zi, but he went by Confucius, and he lived from 551 to 479 BCE. In essence, legalism was built on that strict authoritarian rule. Confucianism was built on the idea that there's a natural order between man, nature, and heaven. So it's just a natural way of the world, and it's much more peaceful in many ways. But there are very specific ways in which we can return from that Seven Warring States period, because that's when Confucianism and legalism and Taoism emerged. We can return away from this disorder to a state of order. And the way he said that is, he said that social order lies within human relationships. He had 5 key relationships. He said the ruler and the ruled, husband, so that's the king and the people, or the president and his people, whoever, the ruler and the ruled, husband and wife, parent to child, older sibling to younger sibling, and friend to friend. He said if everyone maintains their responsibilities that they play in these 5 relationships, then that we will return to a system of social order. That if we mutually respect one another, we mutually meet the needs, if the ruler meets the needs of the people, but the people are loyal to the ruler, then in essence we will naturally return to the state of order. But so there are some couple smaller components to this philosophy. One of them is the idea of called filial piety, which is the importance, filial meaning son and daughters, and piety is sort of being humble. Filial piety is a very important part of Confucianism, where it was important for the young to show respect and to defer to older generations. This is a hugely influential concept in ancient China, and it remains to this day. The idea of not just ancestors that we saw with the earliest dynasties, but that the younger of the two people in the relationship is automatically going to show reverence and to show respect to the older. Particularly important in parent-to-child relationship, an older sibling to younger sibling. Confucianism also valued respect or education and a way to learn and to grow together. But lastly, in practice, Confucianism also promoted, though as you saw from the filial piety relationship, in practice, Confucianism promoted subservience of women. Here we go. This is what I really wanted. I'm sorry for this slide right here. Same exact thing, but just changed the end. This promoted a patriarchal society. A patriarchal society or patriarchy is a society where men have more power than women. So, despite this idea of a natural order, Confucius firmly believed that natural order put men in positions of power and women as being subservient or as answering to men. So, some positive changes that emerged with this philosophy, but also some that are not necessarily very equal. Yet, this philosophy influenced ancient China and modern China more than any others. So, following Qin Shi Huangdi's death, there was a civil war in China. A man named Wu Bang, he was ultimately able to centralize leadership, and he created the Han Dynasty in 206 BCE. This is really where our studies of ancient China were really, the rubber will hit the road here. He moved decidedly away from legalism. That means deliberately away from legalism and towards Confucianism. And so his success, his success was in re-centralizing China. His grandson Wu Di, continued his practices, but he expanded China further, almost to its modern size, largely through warfare. So that's why the Han Dynasty, we can see a massive change in the size of the Chinese Empire. He recreated the bureaucracy, Wu Di, and organized a government rooted in Confucius philosophies of both order and key relationships. So the bureaucracy, same one we talked about already with the Inca, is again dividing up those responsibilities, clearly an indication of Confucian rule. And he also created something known as the civil service exam, which is a test that was used to ensure that qualified people, not just the rich, got jobs. And you can see here there's just a really huge difference. If all people are getting access, they would take this test. And actually, this picture right here, I took these pictures at this Confucian temple right here in Beijing. This is actually where Confucius studied and lived. And these pictures here on the tomb, you can't see it very well, but there's glyphs here of all the names of the people who passed the civil service exam. So this is a really way to equalize society in many ways and to create order in a very different way through education as opposed to through just your strict rule. As I just mentioned, there's a rise in education, poetry, and literature, also a reflection of this Confucian philosophy. Just a little side note, a paper was created under the Han Dynasty too in 105 BCE, so that's where, so that also helped to contribute to this rise of education through access to paper. Lastly, some of the two other accomplishments of the Han Dynasty that will influence their foreign relations. They created tower ships. So tower ships were just essentially floating fortresses, and they also allowed for greater sea power, naval power. And the Han Dynasty invented the wheelbarrow in 150 BCE. What I really want you to focus on for Confucianism, though, is this concept of how Confucianism was implemented in society. We had those 5 key relationships, emphasis on religion, but a true patriarchal society is emerging, where women have more power, or men have more power than women. A very, very big shift from the Mesoamerican and South American civilizations that we've studied. Alrighty, here come those analysis questions. Got all 3. Number 1 actually has 2 questions within it, so make sure you address both. Thank you, guys.